Hey guys, we're going to continue with video lecture for this week again. So make sure you have your notebook paper and you're ready to start taking notes. You learned about a lot of different social movements and reforms that happened during this time period. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we are going to talk about is socialism. So there are two different explanations for socialism and how it can be applied to a society. The first way is an economic version of socialism. And for the economic version of socialism, that is when the government actually owns the businesses. There's no private ownership of businesses. That would mean that Apple, for example, would not be owned by an individual or be owned with stocks, but it would be owned directly by the United States government. We do not currently have economic socialism in the United States where the government owns the businesses. The other kind of socialism is a philosophy of socialism. And the philosophy that is supported by socialism is the goal is welfare of the group. The idea that all people are equal and that they should all be treated equally, and that will provide the best situation for everyone. That is the idea behind socialism, or the philosophy behind socialism. But if we look at history and if we look at the Bible, we see that socialism's foundation is actually incorrect, because socialists believe that man is basically good and that society has corrupted him. Think back to when we were learning about the Age of Exploration and we were learning about the people of Tahiti and how the Enlightenment philosophers wanted to say that the people of Tahiti were the noble savage and that they were good people on their own. But then we look a little deeper and we see that they were cannibals, they had wars among different tribes. So even those Tahitian noble savages weren't really perfect people. And if we look deeper, we look at the Bible and we see that man has sinned. Because man has sinned, we are no longer basically good. And since we aren't basically good, socialism can't end up working out. In America, we have a type of government called capitalism. Capitalism is where there is competition. It ends up having people who are very poor, but also people who are very wealthy, and a lot of people in the middle. A strong middle class is what happens with capitalism. But in socialism, the government is involved, and the goal is to try and keep everyone equal. And they want to control the workers, and they want to control the society. Socialists want no social classes. They don't want an upper class, they don't want a lower class, they want everyone to be equal. But then that also encourages people to not work very hard, because if everyone gets the same thing, why should you work really hard when you're just going to get the same as the person who doesn't work very hard? So that's a big problem with socialism. You need to know what utopian socialists believe. Utopian socialists believe that a person's surroundings impact their character. Utopian socialists believe that a person's surroundings impact their character. I'll say that one more time. Utopian socialists believe that a person's surroundings impact their character. We know this is incorrect, because we know that just because your parents committed a crime doesn't mean that you're going to grow up and be a criminal. This is a logical thing. You have your own choice, you have your own ability to make decisions. So just because you were around people who were criminals doesn't mean that you're going to be a criminal. The same is also true. Your parents could be great, upstanding, moral people, and they could follow all the rules, but their child could end up being a criminal. The way that they were raised doesn't necessarily impact the character of how you end up turning out. All right, now we are going to move into talking about Marxism. Karl Marx wrote the book, The Communist Manifesto, with his friend Friedrich Engels. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. This is an important book, and this is where we understand what his view of communism, another kind of government system, and he explains it and lays it all out in communism. Under communism, we have two groups of people. We have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat are the common people. Proletariat, common people. Bourgeoisie, the wealthy capitalists. Make sure you know those two names, those two groups, and who is in each group. So we have the proletariat, common people, bourgeoisie, wealthy capitalists. And what Marx wanted to see happen between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie was a violent revolution where the workers, which would be the proletariat, overthrow the middle class and the bourgeoisie and create a classless society. So Marx wanted the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. So what is communism? Communism is common ownership of property. Communism, common ownership of property. Communism is common ownership of property when the proletariat establish a dictatorship where the workers are in power. So let me talk to you a little bit, let me give you a little bit more information about socialism. So Karl Marx insisted that under socialism, society would continue to progress until government was no longer necessary. But contrary to what Marx says, the Bible never presents a society without government as being ideal. In fact, the Bible actually talks about how government is important so that the people who are law-abiding citizens will be kept safe. Ironically, socialism has constantly led not to societies without government, but to societies with large and very powerful governments. So it's important that you understand that no communist society has been truly created, because every time communism is tried, the government becomes very, very powerful and the proletariat never achieve a classless society. Also, another thing that we need to talk about when it comes to communism is that generally the standard of living is very, very low. Under capitalism, which is the kind of government, kind of economic system that we have in the United States today, the standard of living is much higher. But in communist countries, the standard of living is very low. China is a communist country. However, they have started to allow some capitalism and some free ownership of business into their economy, and that has helped the economy in China to skyrocket. A couple things to also think about. In Soviet Russia, when the Soviet Union ruled in Russia, people had to wait in long lines to buy basic things such as toilet paper and bread because there were shortages all across the country and people weren't able to get those things readily available in the country that they lived in today, or lived in back then. All right, Karl Marx and religion. Karl Marx believed that religion was used to sedate or suppress the common people and keep them blind to the real need for change. So he didn't like religion. He thought that religion needed to be gotten rid of because it helped people not to be able to see that they needed change to happen. All right, we're going to move into some other popular movements that happened during this time period. And the first thing we're going to talk about under this section is suffrage. And suffrage, you need to know the definition for this. Suffrage is the right to vote. suffrage, the right to vote. Suffrage is the right to vote. There you go. We'll move into the temperance movement in just a moment. Women in England got the right to vote right after World War I in 1828, and women in America got the right to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. So actually America was ahead of England in the ability for women to be able to vote. I'm going to be attaching a YouTube video for you to watch, which is a cover of Lady Gaga's Bad Romance song, but it's all about suffrage, and I think you'll really enjoy watching the video. So the other popular movement that took place during this time was temperance. And temperance has to do with the drinking of alcohol. There are two different levels of temperance. The first is drinking in moderation is temperance, but then there's abstinence, and that is the drinking of no alcohol. So temperance, moderation, abstinence, no alcohol. Make sure you know the difference between those two different ideas. So temperance, moderation, abstinence, no alcohol, so they both have to do with drinking alcohol. England and the United States both tried temperance. In Britain, it didn't really work. There was lots of resistance, and no laws were actually passed in order to stop people from drinking. Things are a lot different in America. A constitutional amendment was actually passed. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, and during the 1920s, there was no drinking of alcohol allowed by law. That doesn't mean that people didn't drink alcohol. That amendment was later repealed because obviously people can buy and sell alcohol today. So that in neither country, in Britain or the United States, there was no law that actually worked well to stop people from drinking. So now let's talk about some other reforms that happened. In England, things moved towards free trade in the economy, which helped the economy to grow in England and led England to be a very prosperous country. They also repealed the Corn Laws so that people could get cheaper food, which is very important for people to be able to get inexpensive food. And then we're going to talk about four different things under political and voting reforms. You're going to need to know all of these four things, so make sure you take good notes here. The first thing is the Reform Bill of 1832. The Reform Bill of 1832 gave the middle class voting rights, but not the working class. So Reform Bill 1832, middle class voting rights in England or Britain. Reform Bill of 1832, middle class voting rights. Then we come to Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. He doubled the number of men who could vote. So we're still only talking about men voting here, but remember, because women didn't get the right to vote until after World War II, which is not going to be until the 1920s. So Benjamin Disraeli doubled the number of men who could vote in England. And we have another reform act, a reform piece of legislation, and this is 1867. And this made it so that all male homeowners could vote. So if you owned a house, regardless of your class, you were able to vote in Great Britain. And our last person that we need to know about is William Gladstone, and he encouraged education for all. He fixed the national court system, and he promoted voting by secret ballot. So Gladstone, education for all, and voting by secret ballot. That means that no one knows how you voted. Your vote is a secret, and no one knows what exactly you voted unless you tell them. So William Gladstone, education for all, and voting by secret ballot. All right, continuing on with the ideas of reform in Western Europe, let's talk about France now. So after Napoleon Bonaparte was removed from power the second time, the country was left in a financial mess, and there was actually another revolution that happened in 1848. After that government, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte came into power. He was actually the Napoleon's nephew, so they are related to each other. And he got elected as president of the Second Republic, and then declared himself as Emperor Napoleon III, and he established the Second Empire. So he came in, got elected, but then took over power. There were some positive areas of growth under Napoleon III. The economy expanded, industry developed, there was freedom of the press, labor unions were created, and suffrage increased. So good things did happen under him, but he's still a dictator and an emperor, so that doesn't mean that there's a lot of freedom for the country. So his rule ended because the Third Republic of Germany declared there was a war between Germany and France, and Napoleon III lost, and the Germans kicked him out, and he was no longer the ruler of France. All right, last slide. We need to talk about Jews in Europe. During this time, the idea of anti-Semitism rose up, and anti-Semitism is hostility towards the Jews. You need to know this because not just for this quiz and for the rest of the school year, but you need to know what anti-Semitism is, and that is hostility towards the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism, hostility towards the Jews. Anti-Semitism actually began in Europe in the Middle Ages, but it continued all the way through to the end of World War II. So during this time period, before World War I, before World War II, there were a few sparks of anti-Semitism in Germany, but we'll see the real blaze of anti-Semitism happen during World War II. Let's talk about anti-Semitism in France. There was a man called Alfred Dreyfus, and in the war between France and Germany, Dreyfus was accused of passing secrets to the Germans. He was tried and found guilty, but he was actually innocent. And the newspapers found out about him, and they exposed the whole situation. He was eventually released from prison and given back his position in the military and restored, but still his reputation was destroyed because of this trial that had happened. And mainly he was put on trial because he was Jewish. Russia also had a very large Jewish population, and so large Jewish population in Russia. There's actually a movie called Fiddler on the Roof, which talks about a group of Russian Jews and what happens to them right before the World War II. So Russia, large population of Jews, and they were persecuted and blamed for all sorts of bad things that happened in Russia during this time period. All right, that is all that we have to cover for lecture this week. Make sure you do all your other assignments, and good luck on your quiz. See you soon.